Fifth meeting of the second session of the 41st Parliament of the Standing Senate Committee on Human Rights. Le Sénat a confié au comité la...
The Senate has conferred upon the committee a study on human rights, international human rights obligations. My name is Senator Jaffer. I'm a senator from British Columbia, and I am the chair of the Standing Senate Committee on Human Rights. I'm pleased to welcome today a number of guests, allow me, and senators.
May I ask the Vice Chair to introduce herself?
I'm Senator Salma Taulajan, and I represent Toronto, Ontario.
Senator Don Meredith, Ontario.
Senator Tanaingo, Ontario.
Senator Betty Unger from Edmonton, Alberta.
Art Eggleton, Senator from Toronto.
You can see most of this committee consists of members from Ontario. At our meeting on December 2nd, 2013, our committee agreed to receive a briefing to examine measures being taken to prevent visible minority youth from being involved in the criminal justice system and from reoffending, with the hope of changing the current overrepresentation of certain groups in the criminal justice system. To begin our hearings today, I would like to welcome the first witness from Public Safety Canada, Mr. Bobby Matheson, who is the Director General of Crime Prevention Directorate. And then we have
Justice Canada.
From Justice Canada, Donald Piragoff, Senior Assistant Deputy Minister, Policy Sector, Elizabeth Hendy, Senior Director, Policy Implementation Directorate, and Hana, Hruska, Director, Programs and Corporate Affairs, Youth Justice and Strategic Initiatives Section. And I understand that Mr. Matheson will start with the remarks, and then we will hear from Mr. Piragoff. Is that correct? Please, Mr. Matheson.
Yes, that's correct. Okay. So, good afternoon, honorable senators, and I thank you for the opportunity to address you today. I understand that you are interested in learning about federal programs and funding to prevent visible minority youth from becoming involved in the criminal justice system. I'll be glad to speak to the work of the Department of Public Safety, particularly in the area of crime prevention within the National Crime Prevention Center. First, I'd like to give a brief statistical overview of some of the data that is currently available to us on visible minority youth and crime. Self-reported delinquency asks samples of youth whether they have committed offenses in the past year. These surveys have been conducted for many years in various countries. Canada last participated in the international survey in 2006. The 2006 survey which targeted school-age adolescent young youth in Toronto, found that the prevalence of delinquent behavior reported by foreign-born youth was lower than it was for Canadian-born peers, 15% and 23% respectively. While the category used in this study was youth from immigration, it is fair to say there is some overlap with youth from visible minorities. A second data set is police reported crimes report offenses that are brought to the attention of police. And while many police services may capture information on race for investigative purposes, this information is not part of nationally available statistics. As such, we do not have systematic data on police-reported crime among visible minorities at the national level. Le troisième type de données provient.
The third type of data comes from victimization surveys, conducted every 5 years. The 2009 survey only contained limited analysis on visible minorities, but observed nevertheless that rates of violent victimization were lower for people who identified as visible minority, that's 76 per 1,000 people, than for non-visible minorities, that's 124 per 1,000 people. According to the 2004 findings, visible minorities experienced comparable rates of victimization for violent crimes to non-visible minorities for both sexes. The report also found that being both a visible minority and Canadian-born reduced the odds of being a victim of a violent crime by about 40%. The three data sources I've discussed provide but an initial glimpse into the experiences of visible minority youth in Canada in relation to the criminal justice system.
Visible minority youth are not at particularly high risk of offending as compared to their non-minority counterparts. However, we must be cautious in the generalizations we make, given there remain significant gaps in our knowledge of the relationship between being a youth from a visible minority and crime. In terms of public safety, the Department is responsible for providing advice and implementing responses that address a vast array of issues from national security to cybersecurity, emergency management, and responses to crime. In this latter respect, our branch is responsible for the continuum of initiatives that include proactive preventative measures to divert at-risk youth from involvement with crime through effective policing and border strategies, as well as evidence-based corrections and community integration programs. I am pleased now to speak about Public Safety's National Crime Prevention Strategy, managed through the National Crime Prevention Centre, and the types of community-based projects that we fund, including those with youth from visible minorities. Through this strategy, Public Safety aims to develop and disseminate knowledge of effective crime prevention interventions in order to help decision makers at all levels of government and in communities make informed decisions about the most appropriate preventative measures. This is achieved through providing time-limited funding to organizations to implement evidence-based crime prevention projects with at-risk populations and conducting robust evaluation studies of selected projects. Individuals are considered at risk for offending when they present a number of risk factors. At the individual level, we look at prior delinquency, aggression, and early substance abuse, for example. Peer-related factors that considered are a high commitment to and or interaction with delinquent peers, Within the school, factors are poor school performance, expulsion or suspension. At a family level, a history of family violence, and community-related factors such as high levels of crime and feelings of insecurity. These NCPC-supported projects work with participants to reduce the impact of these risk factors, and many of these projects have proven successful in reducing youth crime and involvement in the justice system, including a number of which work with youth from visible minorities. NCPC is currently funding 17 projects that work with visible minority youth. These projects over their lifetime represent an investment of approximately $36 million and are expected to reach more than 3,000 children and youth from visible minorities. A few examples. Le projet Wraparound Souris, mise en œuvre à Souris en...
The Wraparound Survey project in Surrey, BC. This project is based on the Wraparound Milwaukee model, which is a unique system of care for children with serious emotional, behavioural and mental health needs and their families. The model focuses on strength-based, individualised care through the delivery of a comprehensive array of services to delinquent youth and their families. The city of Surrey is home to a diverse ethnic population, and so the wraparound model was adapted to ensure it was culturally appropriate and that ethnic affiliation was taken into account when assessing risk and protective factors, as well as developing plans of care. This project has facilitated an effective school RCMP partnership response to youth who are at risk of joining gangs or who are gang involved. Evaluation results show a significant decline, that is 67%, in police contacts among participants relative to the comparison group. The program partners have affirmed that the Surrey RAP gave them more resources and tools for addressing youth gangs and youth violence in their neighbourhood. The Stepping Out project was developed and launched by the Edmonton-based Centre for Newcomers in April 2010. The project aimed to prevent immigrant adolescents and young adults aged 17 to 27 years from joining gangs, and to help those who are already involved with gangs to discontinue their gang association and criminal involvement. Further to a very successful symposium organised by CFN and attended by 160 representatives of 63 organisations, the project developed a community action plan to support gang-involved and at-risk immigrant youth.
Intervention Toronto for Youth at Risk of Gang Involvement is implementing an integrated, targeted, and evidence-based community program that reduces and prevents the proliferation of gangs in vulnerable Toronto neighbourhoods. The approach includes an outreach and referral process that is linked to other community resources likely to have contact with gang-involved and at-risk youth. An intake process that will be used to develop an in-depth needs assessment for referred youth, individual case management plans, intensive group-based training opportunities, practical supports for families of participating youth, and broader community education, engagement, and evaluation activities to increase awareness about gangs and gangs prevention. This project has achieved numerous positive results, including a statistically significant decline in criminal victimization, a greater short-term decline in nonviolent offending than members of the comparison group, and a slight decline in self-reported arrests between the pre- and post-test periods. There was a large statistical significant decline in arrests between the pre-test and 6-month follow-up period. Finally, in Montreal, we have provided funding for a strengthening family program project in a Black Anglophone community. The project includes child training sessions where participants learn about anger and stress management, emotional management, conflict resolution, peer resistance, as well as build knowledge of the effects of drugs and alcohol. This model also includes parental training sessions which focus on learning to clarify expectations of children's behavior, using consistent and appropriate discipline techniques, and using effective communication. Finally, in combined family sessions, the families learn about conflict resolution and practice communication skills. This project has demonstrated positive results as well, including statistically significant improvements in all measures of family functioning and parenting, family organization and communication, parental self-control, involvement, and positive parenting. I hope this provided you with an appreciation of some of the types of projects supported by Public Safety Canada to prevent youth, including youth from visible minorities, from coming into contact with the criminal justice system in the first place. The results achieved so far are impressive and provide practical information that local communities, governments, and decision makers at all levels can use to implement appropriate preventative measures in their own respective jurisdictions. I'd be pleased to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Matheson, and there will be questions at the end.
Okay.
But may I please ask you to clear up something you've said, police reported crime statistics, where you said that report offenses are brought to the attention of the police, while in the investigation there may be information on race and ethnicity for investigative purposes, but this is not available nationally. The statistics are not available nationally. Why is that?
At the moment, there's no reporting mechanism, and in some cases, it remains a privacy issue as far as I understand.
Is there any other data collected for other groups or any other issues collected nationally?
Not that I'm aware of.
Thank you. Mr. Piragoff? Sure.
Thank you.
But Mr. Matheson, just to pick up on that, it's not available from the police records, but you do have it for adults. Is that true?
Yes, but not by subgroups.
Not even for adults? Because I read in the briefing note from our analysts here that we do know that, in fact, a disproportionate number of people from the black population. However, black inmates make up 9.5% of the prison population, although blacks represent only 2.9% of the general population. So is there not a statistic involving youth, black youth, or any other color?
At the level of the police,
Oh.
in terms of police interventions, we don't have that at the national level.
But what about in the penal system? This is in the penal system, the statistic I just read to you. Pardon?
Maybe my colleagues.
Okay. The OCI report, all right.
That's the report that we're basing this on, and that's corrections. And so my colleague's question would be, okay, how is that data collected?
Within the corrections system.
Okay. So we do have it within the correction system, just not from the police.
Yeah. Correct.
We also have it for Aboriginal people. We do have some collection statistics for Aboriginal people, national, federally.
In terms of interactions with police?
Yes.
I'm afraid I would have to go back to the.
Can you please and let us know? Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today with you. Comme Madame la Présidente a déjà dit, je suis accompagné.
As the chair already indicated, I'm accompanied today by Elizabeth Hendy.
Version and rehabilitation programs for visible minority youth. We will particularly focus on how the Department of Justice's Youth Justice Services Funding Program and the Youth Justice Fund are addressing the needs of this demographic. To a large extent, funding programs of the Department of Justice are focused on young persons who are already in conflict with the law, as opposed to crime prevention. Let me first provide an overview of the youth criminal justice system. The federal and provincial territorial governments share joint responsibility for youth justice. Federal government is responsible for criminal law, including the Criminal Code and the Youth Criminal Justice Act, or also known as the YCJA for short. While on the other hand, the provinces and territories are responsible for the administration of those two acts. The Youth Criminal Justice Act, which governs Canada's youth justice system, applies to youth at least 12 years of age but under 18 years old who are alleged to have committed criminal offences. The Act came into force in 2003. It introduced reforms to, amongst other things, reduce the use of the courts and incarceration in less serious cases, support the effective reintegration of young persons released from custody, and better take into account the interests of victims. It was amended recently in 2012 to strengthen the ways in which the youth justice system deals with repeat and violent offenders. The recent changes were intended to respect the rights of the accused without allowing these rights to take precedence over other interests, such as community safety. The Youth Criminal Justice Act aims to reduce the overuse of the formal court system and of custody for all youth by ensuring that alternatives to charges and to custodial sentences are used whenever appropriate. Under the Act, a youth sentence must be the least restrictive and most likely to rehabilitate and to promote a sense of responsibility and an acknowledgement of the harm to the victim and the community. The Act specifically states that all available sanctions, other than custody, that are reasonable in the circumstances should be considered for all young persons. In addition, the Declaration of Principles in the Youth Criminal Justice Act states that measures taken against young persons should respect a variety of factors, including gender, ethnic, cultural, and linguistic differences. Les provinces et les territoires sont responsables de l'administration.
The provinces and territories are responsible for the administration of the Criminal Justice System Act for adolescents, including the delivery of programs and youth justice programs and services.
The Youth Justice Services Funding Program. Through the Youth Justice Services Funding Program and the Intensive Rehabilitation, Custody and Supervision Fund Program, these two separate programs, the federal government provides financial support to the provinces and territories for the delivery of programs and services that target youth in conflict with the law. The Youth Justice Services Program has existed since 1984 under various names. Federal support assists each province and territory in providing a wide range of youth justice services and programs. The funding agreements provide $141.7 million annually for youth justice services that directly support the policy objectives of the Youth Criminal Justice Act. Services, programs, and activities include diversion or extrajudicial measures and sanctions, rehabilitative and reintegration services, judicial interim release programs, and intensive support and supervision programs, and other community-based sanctions. The funding is particularly instrumental in supporting programs designed to deal safely with the high-risk group of offenders. In youth custody centers administered by the provinces, custodial staff work very hard to match youth justice services with the individual needs of the youth. Staff are educated to create an unbiased, accepting environment to meet the needs of young people in order to enhance their experience within the youth justice system. Custodial staff ensure that services accommodate special needs and circumstances. As I mentioned, the Youth Justice Services Funding Program provides all provinces and territories with an annual financial contribution totaling $141.7 million to assist in the delivery of various programs and services that target young persons in conflict with the law. These programs and services aim to protect the public by 1. Encouraging proportionate and timely accountability for unlawful behavior. 2. Encouraging effective rehabilitation and reintegration of young persons into the community. And 3. Reserving the formal court process and custody for the most serious offenders. I'd like to say a few words about the Intensive Rehabilitative Custody and Supervision Program. In addition to the Youth Justice Services funding agreements, provinces and territories have supplementary agreements in place to assist the jurisdictions in providing specialized assessment and treatment services for serious violent youth offenders with mental health problems. These supplementary agreements fall under the Intensive Rehabilitative Custody and Supervision Program. There is approximately $11 million made available to provinces and territories under this program. Under this program, eligible costs associated with the treatment of these serious high-risk, high-need youth may include, for example, reports and assessments, custodial programming, and rehabilitative and reintegration services. The funding goes as a priority to intensive therapeutic programs for individual youth to reduce the likelihood of future offending. I'd now like to talk about the Youth Justice Fund, the third major fund. The Department of Justice administers the Youth Justice Fund, a $4.5 million discretionary grants and contribution program that supports projects that encourage a more effective youth justice system, respond to emerging youth justice issues, and enable greater citizen and community participation in the youth justice system. The Youth Justice Fund has three components, or three smaller separate funds. The main fund, the Drug Treatment Fund, and the Guns, Gangs, and Drugs Fund. The main fund supports a broad range of projects with youth involved in the justice system. The Drug Treatment component supports drug treatment programming for youth involved in the justice system, and the Guns, Gangs, and Drugs component responds to youth involved in the justice system and who are involved in or vulnerable to gun, gang, and drug activities. It promotes the provision of community-based educational, cultural, sporting, and vocational opportunities to these youth to allow them to make smart choices and resist gang involvement or exit gangs. Youth justice funds generally involve youth in the deep end of the youth criminal justice system, that is, those in custody or on probation and those who have high needs. This includes, in particular, gang-involved youth. Projects last up to 3 years. The fund also supports smaller projects, such as community assessments, workshops, and planning sessions. For example, 4 years ago, the fund sponsored community assessments and workshops across the country to develop anti-youth gang action plans. Many of these took place in communities with high visible minority populations, such as Toronto's 13 priority neighborhoods. The Youth Justice Fund's flexibility makes it a valuable addition to our toolkit in addressing youth crime. The fund has no predetermined regional allocation and is therefore able to effectively target priority regions and youth populations. The fund has supported many pilot projects to assist visible minority youth who have come into conflict with the law. For example, here in Ottawa, it is supporting the Rideauwood Addiction and Family Services initiative for an addiction treatment project involving Somali Canadian youth. Staff at Rideauwood found that for cultural reasons, their regular programming was less effective for these youth. In response, they developed programming using addictions workers from the Somali community to act as role models and provide culturally sensitive interventions for Somali youth. Another example is the Nine Heavens Healing Academy, which relocated mostly Afro-Canadian youth involved in gangs from the Jane Finch area of Toronto to Georgian Bay for weekend camps with a curriculum involving life skills and substance abuse counseling and vocational learning. And in Winnipeg, the fund is supporting the New Directions program in implementing an educational and life skills program for newcomer refugee youth involved in the youth justice system and in gangs or at risk of gang involvement. The program assesses the life, education, and work skill levels of the youth and creates learning plans, mentors, and supports the youth through the development of a resume and provides assistance in finding jobs or returning to school. Il ne s'agit là que de quelques exemples. Vous trouverez.
These are but a few examples. More information, including project descriptions, summaries of project evaluation results, and in some cases, project videos are available on the Justice Canada website. I hope that this provides you with a clear overview of some of the Department of Justice Canada's initiatives in addressing the overrepresentation of visible minority youth in the criminal justice system. We would be pleased to now take your questions.
We will now go on to questioning. I will start with Senator Hubley.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and welcome today, and thank you very much for your presentations. My first question, and I must say it's commendable, the number of programs that are there to support young people when they do come into conflict and with the justice system. In the event that they are facing charges, what support system is in place then to give them the needed information and the needed education so that they can make the decisions that are best for them as they progress through the justice system? Are there such programs available? And if there are, could you give us a bit of insight into them?
Because these are involve criminal charges, even though they are proceeded with under the Youth Criminal Justice Act, youth are entitled to legal aid if they qualify, or have their own counsel. So primarily, advice would be provided by legal counsel or through legal aid programs.
I was somewhat taken aback at thinking of a 12-year-old who might be involved in that system. I believe it is 12 till 18 was the figure. I'm just wondering if that young individual does not have, say, parental support there. Would that, the advice from either legal aid or from a lawyer, be sufficient for that young person to understand exactly the system that he's being faced with and what the repercussions might be?
Thank you, Senator.
Yes.
There are obligations under the Act for the involvement of parents, notification of parents. So it's not quite like the adult system where the accused is on their own. There are obligations to involve the parents.
And that is something that would be a priority, would you say, that a young person would have that kind of support with them?
Well, it's a requirement in the law.
Requirement? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. The other question, and I'll...
Question.
Sure.
May I, Senator Meredith has a supplement.
Yes, sorry.
Senator
yes, you go
Hughley,
ahead.
just with respect to those young people who are not given adequate representation. We see a correlation between those individuals who get legal aid or get counsel at the time of being arrested and being involved within the system. I found that, especially amongst visible minorities, someone who's been working in this area for the last 12 years, there's been an overrepresentation of those individuals who are not getting access to counsel right away. And thus they're being involved, getting, basically there's no counsel, there's no parental follow-up. They are more likely to be involved in the system, other than those who receive counsel. Can you elaborate on that for me in terms of what steps are being taken to ensure that young people are getting the proper counsel? Because there's a correlation between those who do not and the higher rates of incarceration.
As I mentioned at the beginning, we share this area with the provinces and the territories. While we fund programs, provide funding to the provinces, it's the provinces who administer the funds, it's the provinces who prosecute the offenses, it's the provinces who investigate the offenses, and it's the provinces who administer legal aid programs. So that's really something which is beyond our ability to comment on.
But wouldn't you think that there is, the government is funding the provinces, so in terms of effectiveness of funding, as to the results that are being achieved in terms of the number of young people who are getting caught up in the system. I guess what I'm asking is that is there some sort of follow-up with respect to the province reporting back to the federal government to say this is how we've allocated our funds and this is where we see gaps and where we possibly need more funding?
The Youth Justice Services Fund that I mentioned we do negotiate goals and objectives with the provinces, and that's part of the condition of the funding. It's not a pure transfer program where we just hand the money over. There are some goals, and actually our lead Canadian negotiator Elizabeth Hendy is sitting with me to my left. So actually I'll let her answer the question as to how we set goals and objectives with the provinces and how we follow up with them.
Thank you. Chair, if that's okay with you. Go ahead, sorry.
Okay. And first of all, to get back to your first point, under the Act, there are specific requirements to ensure that youth are provided appropriate counsel because of their young age. So that is taken into consideration. It is part of the preamble of the Act. So unlike the adult system, there is to make sure that no youth goes unrepresented. Okay, in terms of, as my ADM mentioned, we do have specific requirements that we're asking that the provinces adhere to. And obviously, then the agreement is tailored and flexible enough so that depending on the youth population within a particular province, they can tailor those requirements just within the flexibility to meet the needs of that offender population. So, for example, in Ontario, if there's a greater visible minority population than in some other jurisdictions, they would tailor those programs appropriately, and they do have to report back to us at the end of each year and explain how they use the federal funding.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Hubley?
So there isn't a youth program that would, if a young person was charged, that young person would be sort of nurtured, I guess, into knowing what to expect from the system he's facing. Either from a legal standpoint, or what options are available to them. And I still sort of go back to think of the very young youth that are involved here, and how they would be very easily swept along by a system that they're not really comfortable or know a lot about. And I just wondered if there was a program that might be there to intervene at that point in time for these youth.
Well, from a correctional perspective, where the Youth Justice Services funding program would kick in on the correctional side, there would be, for certain, programming specific to the age of the youth. A 12-year-old would not be placed in the same facility area within the facility as a 17, 18-year-old. So they would definitely take the age of the youth in consideration and take into the consideration of the needs in terms of the intellectual capability of that youth to understand his or her reasons for where they are. So that is definitely taken in consideration.
Okay. Thank you very much. I just had one other quick question. Of the programs, and you've pointed out several of them to us. I think, Mr. Matheson, in your presentation, you talked about the wraparound survey project and stepping out and so on and so forth. Are these ongoing projects? Do we have the confidence to know that there will be programs like this for our young people, or do they have a time frame, and is it a case of funding running out at some point in time, and at that point what do we do after that?
The funding we provide is up to 5 years. It's understood by the project proponents at the time. The main objective of our funding is actually to look at how these models work, and I mentioned about the robust evaluation. We take the knowledge that we garner from these projects and make it available to provincial governments, municipal governments, community associations, so that they do know what evidence-based types of interventions actually work with these individuals. In terms of sustainability of programming, federal, provincial, and territorial ministers responsible for justice and public safety have actually made crime prevention a priority. And in November, they approved an action plan, and part of that action plan is looking at how these evidence-based practices can be put in to more broadly put in place. So sustainability is one of the topics we will be looking at the next over the next number of years.
Thank you very much.
Senator Meredith.
Thank you so much. Thank you again for your presentations. A very important topic that we're studying here with respect to the overrepresentation of visible minorities in our in our correction system. But it goes to the root causes of some of these issues. And we talk about crime prevention and funding, $36 million that you mentioned, Mr. Matheson. And I'm always just concerned about the effectiveness of these programs, because we see the numbers keep rising, and the OCI report indicated that there's a 40% increase. And they start out from youth. And how is it that we can be more effective in preventing our youth from going into the criminal justice system and then further being incarcerated, becoming mature criminals? We see the results of having young people over the last 12 years and the escalation of gun violence in 2002, 2003, 2005, the year of the gun. Jane Kriba, Chantel Dunn, and others being gunned down in a metropolitan Toronto. And we consistently see these young people being charged with these heinous crimes, and absolutely support, sort of individuals being removed from society. My concern has always been, what are we doing to prevent? What are we doing to educate those individuals while they're incarcerated to make them better citizens when they do leave the system, so we don't see them being repeat offenders? So if you just, both of you, can sort of elaborate for me from Mr. Brighams' point of view as well with respect to again, the youth side of it, but again, more on the crime prevention side.
So in terms of crime prevention, the risk factors, protective factors, those are things that we look at. And I talked a little bit about it in my presentation, but as individuals go into these projects, we evaluate what their situation is in terms of attitudes, knowledge, contact with police prior to actually going through the interventions, and then we follow them through the interventions and see at the end of the project what are the results. So we are able to determine what works in different communities for different groups. These projects, and there's a number of models that we test, but we actually do them in different communities in the north, large municipalities, smaller communities. In each case, we look at what the results are within that environment. We started this in 2008. It takes a long time to actually get that type of information. It's quite intensive in terms of actually tracking data at an individual level. Mm-hmm. But I must say it's been a real success in terms of the community associations that have accessed this funding. They understand the value of having this evidence and are now actually starting to use that to build community support for ongoing work for where the models work.
Okay.
With respect to the question of recidivism and what type of projects or programs we have, I'm going to ask Ms. Hruska to describe some of the particular projects that we have to deal with youth and recidivism.
As Mr. Piragoff mentioned, the Youth Justice Fund deals with projects for youth who are already in the criminal justice system. So this is a slightly different population and a smaller population than Mr. Matheson's programs. Our projects also have evaluations. We also track the youth as they go through the project, not only in terms of how much contact they have with the criminal justice system, but also other factors that that we see are very related, such as are the youth going to school? Are the youth do they have an attachment to the workforce? What are their relationships with their family? Are they building relationships with pro-social peers? So in general, we get evaluations for those projects and see that generally the youth are impacted by the programs. We also make a strong effort to share the findings from these programs with other stakeholders, with provinces and territories, with community groups, because many of our projects are run by community groups. So we have, for example, webcasts to share learnings from these projects so that these types of interventions can be replicated in other parts of the country.
And are they being effective in terms of reducing, in terms of your statistics, and they give you reports, have they shown a decrease in terms of certain communities that are being impacted by these young people who are getting into, whether it be drugs or gangs and so forth? Are there positive changes that are being made?
There are positive changes that are being made in the course of the youth's involvement with the projects. Now, tracking the youth once they exit the criminal justice system is much more difficult.
So just interrupt. So why is there not a mechanism then in place to say that this individual has been, in contact with some sort of support system? Why is there not a recommendation that we track that individual to ensure that they do not further offend? And be caught up then further into the system?
The Youth Justice Act holds youth accountable. It's not a welfare act. It's basically a mechanism to hold them accountable for any crimes that they have committed. And like the adult system, once you do your time, you do your time. So once the youth has essentially finished his or her sentence, even though that sentence may be in the community, it's over. It then becomes a job of other agencies such as social welfare, etc. But the criminal justice system loses control of the individual once the probation period ends, once their formal custody period, well, not custody, but probation or other type of conditional release ends. So
there's no formal tracking of them whatsoever.
Not once they're totally out of the system.
Okay. Chair, if I may, just a quick...
Round?
Okay, just a quick mental health issue, but we'll go on to the next one.
Well, let me first of all try to see what we have here in terms. I mentioned earlier a number for black inmates. 9.5% of the prison population, although representing only 2.9% of the general population. So there are some statistics, but then I note that it is not disaggregated based on race in Canada. It is difficult to analyze the reasons for overrepresentation of visible minorities in criminal justice system. So we seem to have some data, but we don't have data. And as I think Mr. Matheson pointed out, it isn't available police, but there is data that seems to be available from the correctional system. So can I get it straight? How reliable is the information we do have, or what additional information would be helpful to get a better handle on exactly what the visible minority population is in terms of running to the criminal justice system?
And if I may please add a supplementary to your question so you can answer it, is that I'm really confused as to, is there any data to clarify the stats regarding the youth? Do we know if there is an overrepresentation in the prison system of black youth? We don't have the data. We don't even have the data for visible minority. What data do we have?
From the crime prevention perspective, I wouldn't have that with me. I would have to go back and see what is available. But my understanding is at the national level, we don't have much information.
We would have to go back and check with Statistics Canada as to what they actually collect from the provinces. But from my understanding, when the provinces send me in their reports, they would not aggregate it to that level of detail.
Well, yeah, I'm going to think about that a little further. Let me ask Mr. Matheson about the 17 projects that work with visible minority youth. Well, there's obviously somebody that's figuring out who a visible minority is for the purposes of these programs, $36.8 million. Senator Meredith has asked about the effectiveness of these programs. I'd like to know about how close they come to meeting the need. Are there a lot more applicants than for these particular funds than there is money available, and if so, how much more? Is this a drop in the bucket, or is it really meeting most of the problem, or somewhere in between?
Okay. We have $40.9 million in funding available for projects each year. The projects are based on proposals that come from right across Canada, from municipal governments, police associations, nonprofits. So in those cases, those project proponents identified visible minorities as the target group within their community. So in some cases, for example, in Halifax, they saw the problems in a black community. So that's how we arrived at projects with visible minorities. We have calls for proposals periodically as funds become available. They're not always available each year, given the projects can last up to 5 years. And there are always more proposals, but we actually have quite a rigorous process of reviewing proposals, and the requirements for managing these projects are quite rigorous because we require so much of an evaluation perspective to determine what actually works for these youth. So I would say we're doing well with the funding we have. It's a significant amount of money that we are putting forward. I think our ultimate objective is to take the knowledge from those projects and work with the provinces and communities, knowing that this is what type of interventions work, what the benefits are from a cost to the criminal justice system, particularly at the provincial level, that these types of interventions get implemented and funded by other levels of jurisdiction.
I'm still trying to get an answer here as to, 17 projects you've noted here, and how many did you turn down, though? How many other projects? Now, yes, you said there's a very rigorous process involved here, but You know, are there a lot that you don't have money for?
There are some. I don't have a number on
Okay.
just on the tip of my tongue how many projects.
Okay, well, let me ask you something else here.
Yep.
Then. I take it, so you evaluate all these programs. You've given some good examples here of ones in different communities across the country. So you evaluate these, I assume, and determine that they're effective or not effective. What about the ones that are effective? What about sharing them with other jurisdictions? If a wraparound project works in Surrey, maybe it'll work some other community. Do you do that, or will you pay for if you find a project that works well in one community, will you encourage and pay for it in another community, or do you only do it once?
We do some replication where maybe in a different type of environment or community where we think we can learn more from the intervention. Where we have results, and we're just starting to get the results in the last year or two, we actually disseminate that knowledge to communities via the web. We also have networks of associations across the country to get that information out. And we, through our regional offices, we also have experts in crime prevention that can help these communities set up these projects.
Okay. Yeah.
I want to ask questions.
Oh, sure. Okay, put me down for the next round.
I am really concerned about the tact you've taken in the funding programs. You've only talked about programs for the youth. You've talked about the Youth Justice Fund, and you've appeared to focus on projects that work with youth to prevent them from making choices that increase their risk of coming into conflict with the law. But everyone sitting here knows that there is a systemic problem. Everyone here knows that you don't have to be a black youth to know that you will be stopped more than any other youth in Canada. Everybody knows that there is a systemic problem, and I'm really concerned that in all the things that you've all said, what are you doing to deal in the justice system, in the correctional system, with the issue of visible minorities and the systemic discrimination?
Perhaps I can start. Some of these interventions, such as the wraparound, bring in other services that do try to help these youth attend school so they have a greater probability for finding employment.
No, I'm not talking about the youth. What about our systems that are discriminatory, that are systemically discriminatory? What about the police that will stop the young person, black youth in Toronto, because he's in a fancy car? How are you dealing with those? How are you dealing with the systemic issues around in the system, the systemic discrimination? You have, both of you have, both the correctional and public safety and justice. You've only focused on what happens to the youth. But what about focusing on the issues of systemic discrimination? You haven't spoken about that at all.
I can answer. Thank you. Senator, there are some projects that we have funded which have dealt with police discretion. The Youth Justice Act provides for diversion of youth at the front end so that they do not go into the system. And so they basically are diverted into programs as opposed to going into the actual youth justice system, which then takes you, with the criminal charge and eventually going before a youth justice court. We've had some programs in the past to educate police with respect to the provisions in the Act concerning diversion, when it is appropriate to divert youth, and that would be the situations where police officers would exercise discretion to not send certain youth into the criminal justice system, or to decide that for various factors they will proceed with the charge. So that's part of some programs that have been dealt with under the Youth Justice Fund. But to a large part, given the mandate of the programs that justice administers, the youth are already in the criminal justice system. As I said at the beginning, we're dealing with the youth who are already in the system. We're not dealing with youth who are not in this. We're not dealing with crime prevention.
Sorry, maybe I'm not making myself clear. Mr. Piragoff, justice deals with lots of issues. You deal with issues of training judges on issues. You deal with issues of training prosecutors on issues facing Canadians. What I'm asking is, what are you doing? There is no doubt that there is systemic discrimination in the system against visible minority youth. What are you doing to train on that issue?
As I said earlier, Senator, the administration of justice, including the administration of police services, is a provincial responsibility except for the RCMP. So that is a policing responsibility. It's a responsibility of the Attorney General of each province in terms of providing policy directions.
Okay, answer
to the
me.
prosecutor.
Are you dealing with it, or because we have almost run out of time?
Senator, I did mention we had some programs that dealt with training police officers how to administer the provisions of the Act that provided for diversion. Diversion is the process.
I wasn't talking about diversion. We've run out of time. May I please ask that you provide that? What I want, can you please provide in writing, what I want is what programs are you doing to deal with systemic discrimination within the system? What is happening? How are you training RCMP when they first come in contact with a visible minority youth? How are you dealing with issues of systemic discrimination? Can you please provide that to the clerk in writing? We have 4 people who have questions. If I may respectfully ask that you put your questions, and if they're long, we will ask them to provide them in writing. If they're short, we'll deal with them now. We'll start with Senator Seidman.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much. If I might try to understand the jurisdictional issues in both the public safety programs you've spoken to and the justice piece. And if you could help me understand what role, how much work do you do with the provinces? Do you do work with cities? How do you disseminate to them? How do you divide up the work? If you could give me some idea of how the jurisdictional issues play out here, I would appreciate that.
Okay, so I'll get all the questions, and if you can answer them together, please, because we've run out of time.
Could I just then, if they're not going to answer my question, then...
No, they are.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Senator Atulajan?
Thank you.
I'm sorry,
okay.
but I had one to that
sure,
question.
Please go ahead.
And that is there a role for the private sector? So do you do work to encourage the private sector to get involved in some way or other? That would be as a partner along with the federal, provincial, municipal jurisdictions. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Atulajan?
Chair, what I would like to know is Region Crime Prevention Council, the most prevalent risk factors for youth gang involvement include limited attachment to community, poor parental supervision, which I think is a very important factor. I mean, parents need to have some responsibility in everything that's happening, and they need to be aware of what kind of activities their children are engaging in. Problematic school alcohol and drug abuse, poor educational or employment opportunities or potential. Can you tell us about the drugs component of the Youth Justice Fund and the importance of this component?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you say that it was after a very successful symposium, well attended, the project developed a community action plan to support gang involved and at-risk immigrant youth. I was just also wondering about definitive results from that. You say it was successful, and I know of the Center for Newcomers, but I'd just be interested in that. And also, with regard to the funds that are distributed, when they get to the provincial level and are disseminated, are the police most likely to get the bulk of the funds, or is there an equal distribution? Because the police seem to always, when a youth commits, the police are called. So I'm just wondering if they get more than the others. Thank you.
No?
Senator Unger here. I just asked the question is, could you provide us the concrete program or project funded under the Youth Service Funding Program, and who's accountable for that project? Let's say you say you funded police, you funded other project as well. Could you let us know the amount? Because altogether, according to the Justice Department, said $140 million. And where it goes, go to whom, and who's responsible for that? And is that okay? Yeah. All right, that's good.
I had a very short question.
Thank you so much. My question was to Mr. Murgo, if you can provide, you talk about $11 million funding for mental health. We know that a lot of our young people are facing mental health challenges. Is that enough funding for across the country, $11 million? And can you provide us some more details as to how those funds are allocated, and do we need to see a ramp up? And in terms of Mr. Matheson, with respect to intervention and prevention, we spend more on the back end incarcerating. Why are we not spending more on the upfront? So in terms of just some positive initiatives that can be shared across Canada, when we look at Surrey, BC, or Edmonton, or North Preston, Nova Scotia, or Toronto, there's some initiatives that the department has taken on. We need to be able to share these best practices. So I think a report of some sort to this committee would help to, as we put our report together. So I'd appreciate that as well.
Thank you, Senator Meredith.
Thank you.
No, we can't. There are many questions, and what I ask that whatever you can answer in the next few minutes, please do, and the rest you can, if you can provide us in writing. And also, when you provide us in writing, one of the things that you've said, you have no jurisdiction over the police forces because they're provincial. I understand that youth fund is also provincial, yet you do fund that. So please answer that in your written answer. But who is wanting to proceed? Ms. Hendy?
I'll answer question 1, 4, and 5.
Okay.
The Youth Justice Services Funding Program is a transfer payment between the Federal Department of Justice and the provinces for correctional services for youth. So that's a direct federal provincial transfer, which has federal policy objectives that the provinces have to adhere to. I can provide by separate cover the amount of money that is provided to each jurisdiction in terms of how the $141 million and how it is split between provinces and territories. The money is given directly to the provincial ministries in terms of the involvement of the private sector. If they wish to bring in service delivery agencies that are not provincial, they can do so through subcontracts. But that would be up to the province within each administration of justice to determine how to use that funding. So in terms of who is responsible, I can get you that chart so you can see exactly how the money is distributed. In terms of the IRCS program, just to clarify, it's dealing with young offenders with mental health issues who have committed serious violent crimes. So it's not for youth at large with mental health issues, it's for youth within the youth criminal justice system with mental health issues. This is tailored funding per youth in the system. So if there is an individual, for example, in Alberta on a IRCS sentence, that youth would be eligible up to $100,000 a year, working on a dedicated treatment plan to ensure that we work through the province with that youth to reduce the level of violence. So when that youth is returned to the community, there is a hope that their level of violence will be decreased and there will be reduced recidivism. So it's a very tailored program working with the needs of that individual youth. Again, I can get you detailed information if you wish on that program. And then.
Sure, I can respond to the question relating to the drug treatment component of the Youth Justice Fund. That is money that is allocated specifically to projects which provide drug treatment to youth who have substance abuse issues who are already in the criminal justice system. So that may be youth in custody, youth on probation. It is often drug treatment provided by community drug treatment providers. So that is essentially what those monies are for. I'd also like to add a little bit to the question relating to the mental health. Youth Justice Fund projects generally have a mental health component because mental health issues are very prevalent in the criminal justice system. And so these are projects that deal with youth who may not have committed the level of crime that you need to commit to be under an IRCS sentence. However, it is health assistance.
Well connected with provinces and territories. As I mentioned, ministers have this as a priority. So actually, crime prevention work is reviewed by a committee of federal provincial deputy ministers, ADMs, and there is actually a working group that is following along the action plan. We network with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. There's actually a project through them at the moment. And at the national and regional level, we do bring in nonprofits that are interested in some of these models, and we actually ask that a lot of the associations that we fund these projects where they're good results for them to get the word out of what works. And we are now starting to look at how we get the private sector more involved. And I think key to getting them involved is having this evidence that shows that when you put your money into a community, you're actually going to get some good results. And getting back to your question, and if we do that more effectively and actually show the cost benefits for crime prevention, we're hoping that this really becomes a much easier business case at provincial municipal levels for crime prevention to be stabilized and even expanded in those communities. In terms of the program stepping out, I'll get more detail on that. The funding is not allocated on a provincial basis, and the proposals, the majority would not come from police associations. Most of them are from nonprofits or municipal government levels. A lot of times they do partner with police, but we have seen a shift where those community associations have taken more of a leadership role, and it's been effective working in partnership with police.
Thank you. You can see the interest we have in what you had to present, and we appreciate you making yourselves available at a fairly short notice. Certainly, we are very appreciative of that, and it's not the first time we've all appeared here, and so whether it's here or in other Senate committees, and so we appreciate your presence, and we look forward to working with you in the future. Thank you very much. We'll take a 5-minute break.
is.
Thank you.
Thank you. Would you like me to start,
Please.
Senator?
Yes, please.
Thank you. We are delighted to be here today on behalf of the Canadian Council of Criminal Defence Lawyers. The organization was founded in 1992 to offer a national perspective on criminal justice issues with a view to ensuring the preservation of constitutional principles which protect us all and to seeing that criminal law develops in a practical and principled manner. Our council represents the views of defence lawyers from coast to coast. The Canadian Council of Criminal Defence Lawyers is very grateful for having the opportunity to address the Senate today and to possibly assist with respect to any deliberations or issues. My name is Lisa Pomerant. I'm a criminal defense lawyer. I've practiced law for 25 years. Throughout the course of my practice, I have always maintained a large youth practice, whether I was practicing law in BC, Alberta, or Ontario, and most of the youth that I have dealt with over the years and continue to deal with are the marginalized youth, the visible minorities. To my left is my esteemed colleague, Miss Emma Rhodes. She's a criminal lawyer who has some expertise, or much expertise, in youth matters. She's an adjunct professor at the University of Toronto, teaching a course about the Youth Criminal Justice Act. She is an instructor at Osgoode Hall Law School teaching trial advocacy. She is the Criminal Lawyers Association rep at a representative at one of Toronto's busiest youth courts, and she volunteers weekly for high-risk youth. The significance of our presence today, perhaps the only significance of our presence, is to tell you what goes on in the trenches, what it's like for these youth, what they're facing, and what the current measures are achieving. So to tell you what's going on at the ground level and how these initiatives are practically playing out, and to indicate that if the systemic issues are not addressed, that these youth will continue to have trouble or to enter into the criminal justice system.
And thank you for having me here. It's an honor to be here. Tell you what I know and what I see. And I can tell you that visible minorities are overrepresented in the criminal justice system. Or put another way, the justice system disproportionately impacts people that are visible minorities. They live in racialized neighborhoods. They live in poverty. They lack access to education. They deal with being unemployable. They are struggling with mental health issues such as depression. They are more likely to come into contact with the police. Statistics about the practice of carding in Toronto. And carding is a practice where Toronto's police forces stop, question, and document people that they encounter on the streets. And statistics about carding in Toronto tell us that people who are black or brown are more likely to be carded than whites. Rates of carding is highest in racialized communities, and that these youth report that they are often searched during these stops, and that these youth feel criminalized by this process. My typical client is a young black man who is not doing well in school. He is in a single-parent family where his mom is working several jobs trying to make ends meet. And because she's working several jobs, she's not at home. He has difficulty attending classes, and he can't pay attention once he's there. He gets involved in a schoolyard fight and is arrested for assault. He is put on a curfew pursuant to a bail. But because the fight happened at school, he is kicked out of his school, as his bail says he is not allowed to have contact with the person that he got in a fight with. And so he has to start attending another school midterm. He is unable to attend that school because he can't afford the bus tickets to get there, and the new school is not within walking distance. His mom works nights and is unable to monitor him, so like most teenagers, he ignores his curfew, goes outside, and is stopped by police because he is a young black kid walking around alone at night in a racialized neighborhood. The police will run his name through the computer, and he is charged with failing to comply, and then with his bail for breaching his curfew. He is arrested, taken into custody, And at 15 years old, he is strip searched because he'll be held overnight for a bail hearing. He is released, and he again breaches his curfew and again taken into custody, strip searched again. This time, he is found with marijuana. Because his mother is working, she is unable to monitor him, and he stays in custody. And the peer group that he comes into contact while he's in custody is not a pro-social peer group. Because he was unable to get to school because he couldn't afford his bus tickets, he misses a year. Because of vulnerable persons, police record check will show that he has assault charges. He is unable to get a job. I hopefully can get him into mental health court, and I will get an assessment for him that his mother would not otherwise be able to pay for. It may be determined that he has ADHD, which explains his lack of impulse control, and he is diagnosed with depression, which helps explains his anger and his self-medication with marijuana. But he is now a year behind in school. He is still living in poverty. He now distrusts the police. And he's been criminalized for a schoolyard fight, which in our day would not have attracted police intervention. Court is the simple part for these kids. Dealing with housing, addictions, mental health issues, and lack of access to education is the tough part. I can tell you that most of my clients, once I get these supports for them, do not come back, and they are no longer my clients.
You're finished, both of you?
If you want me to be finished, I can be finished.
No, please.
The two key indicators, and I'm sure Professor Bala will back me up here in terms of future incarceration, are lack of education and prior incarceration. And the scenario that was just laid out is the typical client that comes in. It's not the serious violent offender. But as Emma pointed out, there's no schooling. Education is lost to this young man. Interestingly enough, what we call the substantive charge, the original assault charge, will go in the garbage, so to speak. He'll be diverted. He'll do extrajudicial sanctions. It's probably something that could have been resolved by way of circling in the school system, but he's lost the year. In addition, the statistics tell us that nationally, 30% of the charges for youth are what we refer to as administrative charges. And that's true provincially as well for Ontario. They hover around 27–30%. So once there's an original charge and they're brought into the criminal justice system, the charges of failing to comply, failing to appear because the kids can't afford bus fare to even get to court, that just multiplies. And you've got kids in the criminal justice system, and quite possibly a youth in the justice system for throwing a snowball or assault in a schoolyard in custody because of these fail to complies. In terms of solutions, I guess the other important factor is that what we know is that approximately 40% of the youth in the criminal justice system are crossover kids. By that we mean that they're also in the child welfare system. And they've probably been in the child welfare system before they come into the criminal justice system. And they're probably in the child welfare system because they've been apprehended, they're at risk, they have no food, they have no housing, they've been wandering the streets, and lo and behold, they wind up in the criminal justice system. If these systemic issues can be addressed, the housing, the jobs, the education, the counseling, I think that would go a long way to preventing the youth from coming into contact with the criminal justice system. And while we applaud the measures that are being taken to date, we need more. We need more resources to help these youth. Changes in the law in terms of bail provisions where there's a presumption against putting kids in custody is very good. But we need to ensure, and I know there was a previous question from one of the senators about representation, the legal aid plans are in trouble. And from a youth's perspective, whether it's federal problem, whether it's a provincial problem, they need representation. And notwithstanding that there is a provision in the Youth Criminal Justice Act that counsel needs to be appointed, there aren't necessarily orders, and as legal aid plans are coming into financial trouble, it's going to be the visible minorities that suffer from that, and those are really the youth that need the representation the most.
Thank you very much. We will now go to the video conferencing, and we'll start with Professor Nicholas Bala, Faculty of Law, Queen's University. Thank you for making yourself available, and we look forward to hearing from you, Mr. Bala. Professor Bala.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can.
Yes. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Bonsoir tout le monde. I have been doing, just by way of introduction, research and writing about youth justice and more generally family justice and child welfare issues for about 30 years. I've been involved here in Kingston as a volunteer with young offenders and serve on some provincial committees that try to coordinate services. I would say that I think it's commendable, first, that the Commissioner of Corrections has done the study that he's done. It's disturbing, but I think it also is very helpful in shedding light on various issues for adult offenders. The Youth Criminal Justice Act and the Youth Justice System, of course, raise different but overlapping issues. I think one important point is that the Youth Criminal Justice Act, which has been in force since 2003, has significantly reduced the use of courts and custody for the majority of young offenders without increasing rates of crime. So when we push down use of courts and custody, make more use of community resources, we are not increasing youth crime. To the contrary, we've actually seen a slight decrease. Having said that, it is clear that we have a disproportionate representation of visible minority youth and Aboriginal youth in both the youth courts and in youth custody facilities. As your questioning has noted already, we do not have national or provincial data on visible minority representation or in the youth justice system. However, we had a number of studies, particularly in Ontario, but elsewhere in Canada and Alberta, that clearly demonstrate that there is overrepresentation. Some of this is attributable to social conditions, and it was referred to whether it's poverty, single parenthood, living in a high-crime neighborhood. Many of these things correlate with visible minorities and Aboriginal status. Having said that, it's clear that even taking all of those social factors into account, there is disproportionate involvement in the youth justice system. As has been noted, and we have research from Kingston, Ontario, as well as Toronto and elsewhere, that police are much more likely to stop a visible minority youth than a non-visible minority youth. If they're in court, they're more likely to be detained, and they're more likely to receive a custodial sentence, even taking account of both the offense and the prior record. We have, I think, had some important work done in Canada, most notably in Ontario. The report by Justice Roy McMurtry and Alvin Curling on the roots of youth violence, to go back and look at the social context of youth offending and how we can address it, both in terms of prevention for under 12s and appropriate intervention for youth who are 12 and older. One of the things, I think your questioning was very appropriately and pointed, that we don't have the kind of data and research that we need to understand the nature of the problems or appropriate responses. One thing we clearly need is better data and also better long-term follow-up research. It was pointed out that some of the programs that are being funded, many of them, there's evaluation, but it's short-term evaluation. We don't follow up on the long-term consequence of intervention or the long-term value of intervention in most cases. We do have some studies, particularly more in the United States and in Canada, that demonstrate that some of these programs do have long-term payoffs. But until we can prove that to funders, we're not going to have the kind of services that we need. Certainly, you've identified issues for training, although they're primarily issues of provincial responsibility. There are significant federal responsibilities in terms of training for police, particularly the RCMP, prosecutors, particularly federal drug prosecutors, and judges about issues around both visible minority status, Aboriginal status, fetal alcohol syndrome. We do have beginnings of education in these areas, but we certainly need more. We also, I think, need more in terms of specific targeted programs. Some of them will be based on ethnicity and race. Some of them will be community-oriented, but focused more on groups that are at higher risk. In terms of legislation, I think, again, it's important to remember that unlike with federal criminal law, where we've seen significant changes that have actually resulted in increases in custody, fortunately, to this point, we have not seen those kind of changes in the Youth Criminal Justice Act. I think the 2012 amendments, some of them cause concerns, but others, I think, are balanced off. I certainly would not like to see legislative change that results in an increase in use of custody. To the contrary, I think we have to be very careful about what we're doing with our Youth Criminal Justice Act. To this point, we've had some success. I think we need to build on that success, particularly with appropriate interventions and more support for community-based responses. Thank you. I'll look forward to your questions, but I used up my time, I think.
Thank you very much, Professor Bala. And we now go to Associate Professor Ming Kwok of King's University College at Western University. Thank you for agreeing us also at a very short notice to join us. Professor?
Yes, thank you for having me. I want to talk about my research area about ethnic minority youth. So I mainly talk about two areas, actually, about the reason for their criminal behavior and interventions. For the causes, I want to highlight 4 points, actually, 4 factors. The first one is about broader opportunities. If the youth, they don't think they have a future in this country because of the skin color, they are not related to this society. I'll give you some example from research, actually. For example, the black and the Asian youth, they are more likely to be think by the people they are associated with gangs members. So that when they are in contact with the law, most of them actually be classified as a gangs member, even though most of them they are not. And the second example is about the first and second generation immigrant youth. Even though some of them are second generation, from the research perspective, many of them are so alienated from the society in the sense that even though they are born in Canada and they speak English without accents, but they still encounter a systemic discrimination in their school as well as in their workplace. Second point about acculturation stress. Many of them actually, when they have criminal behavior because of their lack of a solid cultural identity, they are get stuck in 2 worlds. They are not belongs to Canadian society, and they don't have their solid self-identity in their ethnic culture. The number 3 point is about the access to criminal opportunity. It related to about undesirable peers in their surrounding area, maybe their friends, and they learn that kind of attitude, mindset, and the skill in the trade of criminal world. The last one is about the lack of adequate support system for them, both formal and informal. Informal system like the family and their friends, and the formal support system like the housing, and in the community, they don't have that kind of services for them to support them. And about the interventions, I will provide you some, in the research, some promising practice is like a guiding principle for you, mainly in 4 points. The first one is about discrimination. The literature suggests that we need to address the systemic discrimination against this youth. So all institutions and organizations are recommended to conduct a diversity auditing about their organization and to see if they provide accommodations to this segment of populations. Second point, we have to be cautious when we say visible minority youth. All interventions should be more specific to a certain segment of this invisible minority youth. For example, we cannot put them all in one box. Asian youth is not the same is not the same as the black youth. Some youth, like the Asian culture, when studies say that they are more have a tendency for the internalization of the problem. Some other youth from other culture, they have the opposite response. They are more externalize their problem, so that there's no one solution for all ethnic youth, actually. The other interesting finding from the research is, which related to service provisions, is about, it is not determining factor of the ethnic background of the professional. In other words, if you care about them, visible minority youth and their family will come to seek for help. It goes back to about whether the agency and the staff member, they actually have that kind of diversity and culturally appropriate training to provide services to them. The other point I want to emphasize about the family factor, from many research, we see that the ethnic minority youth actually have a strong connection with the family, regardless about their level of crime involvement. So that all interventions should include the family and the significant other in the intervention strategy. The last point I want to emphasize about the support system. We need to increase and strengthen their support system, both the formal and informal systems, especially about the family and their friends, and the school systems. Most of them, they are lack of that kind of appropriate educations. Without this kind of education, it's more likely for them to be for reoffending, because they don't have the skill and they don't have a job opportunity at all. Thank you.
Professor, and thank you to all four of you for your presentations. We will now go to questioning. Colleagues, all of us want to ask questions, so may I ask that you please have tight questions. We'll start with Senator Atulajan.
Chair, thank you for being here and thank you for the presentation. My question is, we kind of touched on this, that, about social conditions and visible minorities. So when we talk about social conditions, are we talking about levels of income, education, or family life? Like, what role do each of these factors play in youth engaging in criminal activities? Also, the studies and research shows that there's a link between substance abuse and criminal behavior. Do you see that link? And what is being done provincially with regards to the rehabilitation of young people? What is the role of the provinces, if any?
Well, I'm prepared to jump in and start. I'm sure that others will want to respond as well, since it was a general question. And to go to the third point, certainly by and large, responsibility for youth justice, not only for the administration but also for service provision and prevention, is a provincial responsibility. Health, education, and indeed in this regard it's different from the adult sphere, where the adult correction system is a federal responsibility, and it's a provincial responsibility for youth. Having said that, I think the federal government has a very important role in providing leadership, education, sharing of knowledge, and indeed I'm concerned that we've seen some funding cuts in the crime prevention area that I think are very concerning, and in fact, if anything, we need more federal funding for demonstration projects and research in this area. As to the questions you asked about the relationship between social conditions, drug and alcohol abuse, and crime, there's no doubt that all of these factors are correlated, and sometimes there's a causal link. A lot depends on whether you're thinking about this on a societal and systemic level or on an individual level. If you look at any individual youth and say, why is this young person either offending or reoffending and not responding to various kinds of intervention, it's going to be a complex interaction of factors. And so there are some kids who have drug and alcohol problems who are not offending, but we know that those who are offending are more likely to have drug and alcohol problems, and the fact that they have those substance abuse issues and they're not appropriately addressed will contribute to offending and or reoffending. Similarly with issues like single parenting, residing in a high crime neighborhood, certainly having learning disabilities, fetal alcohol and neurological issues, those are all related to offending behavior. And more generally, I think, and I think Professor Kwok made this point, for individual youth, there needs to be an assessment of his or her problems, context, family, school, community issues in order to respond to them in an appropriate way. Different youth have different needs and problems and require different responses. Having said that, I think that the comments that Professor Kwok made about the importance of involving families, parents, even single parents, or especially single parents, involving schools and the issues about education, reintegration into the community are incredibly important. And so we need those kind of integrated, sophisticated responses to youth crime. And it's not only a question of responding to youth crime, it's also a question in the long term. This has economic effects. If we can intervene with young people and get them employed, get them into becoming productive tax-paying citizens, we're going to be a lot further ahead than if we find they're involved continuously in the youth justice and then the criminal justice system and then socially dependent.
Sorry, Professor. Go ahead. Professor Kwok, continue.
Yes, I also want to jump in to say something. There's a correlation between the substance abuse and the crime, but we have to be more careful in the sense that because substance abuse only a symptom from our perspective, it reflects more underlying problem in the community as well as in the family. So when we address this problem, substance abuse, we can approach it as a criminal problem as well as a health perspective. So when we address this one, so that the underlying problem may indicate maybe the family problem, maybe the housing problem, or job employment problem. So we have to be very careful in that in this case. So that going back to this, how we address the whole problem, it is very complex. It should be an integrated approach. We cannot just single out a certain symptom like drug abuse. We have to handle in a more comprehensive manner a multi-level intervention approach, involve the family, the community, in order to engage the young people back to the community.
Thank you. Senator Meredith?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you all again for your presentation. I want to thank you for your commitment to youth. Youth have been my passion for the last 12 years as I've engaged in the Toronto area in stopping youth violence and speaking out about youth violence in our city. And again, I'm taking this to a next level as a Canadian senator, looking at the problem right across our country. Surrey, BC, North Preston, Nova Scotia, right here in Ottawa, Montreal. And I think it's important that we recognize the challenges that our young people are facing, but also recognize, and I want to thank all four of you, for recognizing the systemic issues that exist within the system. The panel before did not acknowledge that, and that's troubling. In terms of, I believe that if there is a problem, we need to address the problem before we can, find those solutions to it. And we know that there is a systemic issue. In your dealing with young people and trying to deal with, advocating on their behalf, what have you put forward in terms of any policy papers, in terms of any changes and recommendations? This is about you again, Ms. Pomerant, as well. You've been doing it for 25 years. I'm sure that you're just tired of talking and telling people this needs to be changed. So I'm sort of curious as to your opinion as well on this. But Ms. Rhodes, if you want to lead off in terms of what you've done to say, look, here's an issue around housing, health, education, economics in terms of employment. For these individuals as they lack these opportunities. We see the percentage based on the OCI report that there's a higher percentage of visible minorities and blacks within the criminal justice system. So I'm curious as to your position on the fact that there is a systemic problem.
There is a systemic problem, and part of what is frustrating as a lawyer is that I'm dealing essentially as a client-on-client basis. So I deal with one client and then I deal with the next client. I can tell you that the initiatives that I have seen work very well, and some of the what I've been involved in, there is a specialized youth court down in Toronto, 311 Jarvis, and they have set up specialized courts. There's a court set up specifically for dealing with young people with mental health and drug addiction issues. There's another court that's set up dealing specifically with Aboriginal youth. And these specialized courts, where they can have different workers within the community all come together and try to address all the issues surrounding the youth. And I see that once they are involved in the criminal system, to have a court that is set up to specifically address their needs have been very effective, because through the court process we can get them involved in a mental health program and drug addiction program, because drug addiction and mental health issues often go hand in hand. There are a lot of young people that are self-medicating, so having the drug treatment court and the mental health court together so that all the issues can be addressed, I find have been very effective. And in most cases, once the court is able to, and hopefully I can help, get the youth involved in appropriate supports in the community, the charges are then withdrawn or diverted, and then the supports are in place, and then that youth has the support that they need. So I think not dealing with it is just, once they're in the criminal system, dealing with, guilty, not guilty, dealing with their criminal problem, but looking at, let's get specialized courts and addressing the young person's needs.
Ms. Ryan.
I think we change things one youth at a time. We change things by supporting the organizations, many of the organizations that you fund, Second Chance Foundation, for example, in Toronto, which goes in and deals with high-risk youth. We've attended many of their graduations. It's inspiring what can be done when you put the proper supports in place. We don't have a lot of time to write papers, but we keep coming out and advocating for more resources for these youth, because no jobs, no support, no counseling, no structure doesn't equal crime prevention. It equals decimated souls and hopelessness, and it equals gang affiliation. So that's what we keep doing. We need more resources for these youth.
Another, Lisa touched on it briefly. Every Wednesday evening, I volunteer in a church basement at Regent Park through a group with an organization called Pathways to Education, which does receive federal funding, and I thank you for that. It's an excellent, excellent program, and it's tutoring young people, and I can in a racialized community, and I can tell you that when I'm not helping them with their math homework, I'm spending a lot of time helping them with their resumes. And and even last week I was helping a young person write his application for a scholarship. And that's what these young people need, is the hope and the opportunity to know that there is a way out. So that I've found it's been one of the more rewarding programs I've been involved in.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much. Professor Bala, we heard from the Director General of the Crime Prevention Directorate, Public Safety Canada, in earlier testimony about the importance of evidence-based research. And you yourself made the point that we need evidence-based research in order to demonstrate that programs designed in this field actually work. So if I use the health field as a paradigm, because that's the field that I personally know best, I know that there's an investment made in longer-term studies to evaluate programs or particular interventions, and they're all in partnership. Public-private sectors and academia, of course, plays a huge role. And so, given the importance of evidence-based research, could you tell me how this paradigm might apply to the youth justice field?
Well, I think that the health model, the control group study, which we can't completely replicate in the youth justice system, but we can use, for example, trying things in one neighborhood and with one project and having comparison community, I think is absolutely essential, and it needs to be done on a long-term basis. We have started to do some of that work. For example, there's the Better Beginnings project, which has been operating in a number of places in Ontario that's been following up young people for over a decade with early intervention and finding the successes of early intervention. Having said that, we need to do a lot more, and I think the federal government has a role here. And with all respect, I think that the earlier presentations, it's not enough to follow young people through the course of program. We have to follow up after they've been through that program to see the long-term consequence of that program. Some programs, unfortunately, seem to work only for a short period of time and don't have that long-term follow-up. I think the other thing that we have to recognize is, and this was pointed out, we need to have replication. And so sometimes programs seem to work, and it's not necessarily because of what they're doing, but because they've managed to attract or be established by someone who is charismatic or who has very good skills with young people, but it's not what they're doing, it's who they are. And so when we go out, we have to try to replicate those programs before we can put them in other places. But I think that there's a great deal more to do in terms of the research, the follow-up, and the dissemination of results. And the federal government has a really important role there. It's certainly starting to play that, but I think it needs to do a lot more.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I wanted to ask you if you would just, I guess I'll ask Emma Rhodes this, if you don't mind, and you've chronologically given us the order of things that tend to happen, and the result is we're looking at charges. And you did mention failing to comply, then being held overnight, strip searched, etc., and eventually staying in custody. What is custody? Where is that? Is that a youth center? And I'd also like to know, in the youth court system, are you experiencing the backlogs that maybe the other justice system is experiencing from time to time? And I would like to add on to that is that you're doing marvelous work in your area. Do you feel that is being replicated across the country? Thank you.
Dealing with the first question, custody, there are two types of custodial facilities for young people. Open custody, which is essentially a group home facility. There aren't cells. They're living in a home within the community. And then there's secure custody, which is the youth version of a jail. In Toronto, I can tell you that for young men, that is at the Roy McMurtry Youth Centre, which is in Brampton, which poses a problem because if their families live in Toronto, how can their families come and visit them? If they don't have access to a car and they're put in custody, they essentially lose that tie to their parent often, and that could be in what they are left with are the antisocial peer group that they're meeting in custody. So it can have a very detrimental effect. With the backlog, I find that one of the purposes of the YCJA is that the impact or the finding or whatever the sentence may be for a young person is supposed to happen pretty close to the offense, because it's supposed to reflect how the youth brain works. And youth, a year is forever for them. And so there is a need to have consequences to an action happen pretty close to the offense state. So things happen quickly, but it's still 6 months to 8 months to 9 months, and for the teenage brain, that still is a far way away. And so I would like to see it a shorter time period, although when we say 6 months, 7 months, 8 months, it doesn't seem like it's a very long time, but for the youth brain to try and connect their action to the consequence, it does create problems, because 8 months, they've moved on. And we know that with teenagers in our own lives, is that 8 months is forever. And in terms of across the country, I can only tell you that I practice in Toronto, so that's my experience.
I just have another quick question, and it's on, are our youth held in remand from time to time? Are they ever remanded?
Yes.
And are they then held in any sort of a different condition
That is up to how they're classified by Corrections Canada, so then it would go back to open custody or secure custody.
Yes, I'll leave that. Yes, thank you very much for.
Thank you.
Sorry.
I want to focus on what the federal government is doing and should be doing. The last panel, we heard from Justice Canada about their Youth Justice Fund. We heard about the Youth Justice Services Funding Program, and Public Safety Canada told us about the National Crime Prevention Strategy. I'd like some commentary on how effective these programs are. Are they meeting valuable needs? Is the funding adequate for them? If not, is it something where we need to double the funding, triple the funding? I'd like to get some idea just how far off the mark this funding is for these programs. But also, in terms of what the programs don't cover, 2 or 3 areas that you think need to be priorities for the federal government in its programming, whether it's prevention or dealing with youth in the system. And particularly moving to visible minorities. These programs are for at-risk youth, whether they're visible minorities or not. But since the subject that we're dealing with here is trying to deal with an overrepresentation of visible minorities, then what further needs to be done in terms of meeting their needs? That's a big question, perhaps, but we are at the federal level, and I'd like to know what we need to do more.
Associate Professor Kwok, wait, did you want to speak?
Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
So, okay, I'll come back to you. Did you want to start?
I'm happy to start, perhaps.
Go ahead.
Yes, well, I think there are a number of issues raised in these questions, and certainly one of them that relates back is the question of the federal role. And the federal role is primarily, I think, for, first of all, funding, carefully funding demonstration projects that can be replicated across the country. That means finding the projects, funding them, and evaluating them in a long-term way. I'm concerned that we're not spending nearly enough on crime prevention. And I think that in the long term, this is a social investment. We have studies, well, we have one study in Ontario, the Better Beginnings Project. We have some studies from the United States that clearly demonstrate that early investment, both in children at risk and also in adolescents, has a long-term economic payoff, provided they're the right kind of programs. Some programming is not very effective, and so we have to have that follow-up component and then dissemination of information. Another issue that was touched upon, I think, and is very important, is the large number of children who are child welfare youth who are in group homes administered by the provinces and may then come involved in the justice system. And I think that Ms. Rhodes was in some ways referring to this, issues about children in group homes, youth in group homes being overly charged and then represented in the youth justice system. I think that's another area certainly where we need to pay significant attention, and to this point we have not done enough. I think it's an area where, and there was mention of the courts in Toronto, the drug court, the mental health court, the Aboriginal court. I think those are all very important. Another area where I think we clearly need to work is on the so-called crossover youth. So there's certainly, I think, a great deal more that can be done. I would respectfully suggest the federal government may have had more of a leadership role in the past than it's having right now in some of these areas.
Ladies at the table.
I think the funding is not adequate. There's a lot that isn't covered. Many of the programs are not, shall we say, culturally sensitive, and I think that until we deal with the systemic issues, that the problems are going to continue to persist. I know when I practiced in Alberta, while the numbers are significantly down now in terms of incarceration rates, I think it was 90% of the youth, of the 250 youth when I practiced there, were Aboriginal youth. Now I think you've got 80 youth in the Edmonton Young Offender Center, and 97% of them, as of this morning's statistics, are Aboriginal. But there weren't any culturally sensitive programs, and there weren't anything for them to come out to. So, and I understand that that's still the case. When I spoke to my former youth worker this morning, he said that we couldn't talk long because he had to get some fresh water to the reserve, and he was dealing with two 11-year-old, not pregnant girls, mothers. So I think that there could be a lot more funding, and there could be funding in terms of preventative measures, funding in terms of the education, funding in terms of the counseling, funding in terms of putting the community supports in place for the single mothers, funding in terms of putting advocates in place for these single-parent families, many of whom are first generation here, who don't speak the language, who can't advocate at the schools to get their children back in schools. And once we've lost them in the educational system, I mean, my personal view is they are lost to us. I think we need more funding in those areas. And who is responsible for that in terms of federal, provincial, and how it's divvied up? I heard some of the answers from the last panel. Doesn't assist the youth. They need those things.
Two very short questions from Senator Meredith and Senator Tulajan, and then if I can... Oh, sorry, Professor Kwok.
Kwok is trying to get it.
Professor Kwok, did you want to...
Yes, I want to jump into for two things in terms of the federal government's role. I think there are two things they can do. The first one in terms of the leadership for funding. In fact, we don't know much about the visible minority youth, the criminal behavior in Canadian context. So we need more good research to understand about this population actually, and what kind of program is more effective for this segment of populations. We need more good data, especially about when we related to, we call it crossover kids. Like most of them actually from welfare system. What are the transitions, and how can we do more prevention work before they go to the criminal justice systems? We need more data in this area in order to design a tailor-made program for them actually. And the second area about implementation, we need to emphasize that when we handle about crime behavior or gangs behavior, it happens in local community. Each community have their unique problem actually. There's no cookie-cutter approach, so that you have to handle community by community. In that sense, the federal role should have a good cooperation, collaboration with the provincial government as well as on the local level, the municipal government, about how to handle the crime way and the local gangs problem in the local community. They have their strengths and limitations. Each community is not the same as the other community.
Very much, Senator Meredith.
Thank you, Professor. Just going back to you with respect to your studies on alienation and not only visible minority youth, black youth, and the different cultures that we have in Canada here. Can you elaborate a little bit more for me on that in terms of what more can we need to have our young people feel validated, to feel that they're part of the Canadian society, and the sense of hopelessness? How do we take away that from these youth? And again, through these programs that was mentioned by the first panel, the intervention and so forth, how do we get to that where we feel that our young people are contributors rather than detractors from society?
The first thing is more long-term about the
Can I ask you, Professor? May I just ask that you wait? Let's get Senator Atula Jan's question as well, and then you can answer both. Senator?
I just have a very simple question. I just want to know that do you think that prevention is the only approach to develop towards crime, or does the government also have to be tough on crime? Thank you, Chair.
All right, there are two questions. The first one addressed about the alienations. So for the long term, we have to address about systemic discrimination against ethnic youth. It's a long-term thing. And the more short-term one, we have to give them some kind of hope and opportunity. When we say hope and opportunity, there's many studies that they need role models. They need more role models in terms like in the school as well as in the employment, because they have to look up to something which they can identify with. The best way to do it is to provide them role models, so that we have to be, like as I said before, we are going to recommend about all organizations, school system, and other workplace systems, they have to undergo that kind of diversity auditing in order to see whether they are going to accommodate the needs of these populations. Of course, we give them a hope, we also give them a skill, and we have to accommodate them about what are their learning style. For example, some cultures, they have placed more emphasis on education. Even though their kids, their children are involved in crime, they try their best, they try their resources in order to get them back to the normal school. So in that case, that means it's a linkage for them to get back to the mainstream society. We have to build that kind of linkage for them to back to society again. And going back to the second question about the prevention or rehabilitation process, do we need more money to put on the prevention? Yes. And why I say that in this way, because according to research, when we study about the criminal pathway, it is more effective to target people before they commit crime instead of when they are getting more involved into the criminal system. It's less effective. So we need to put more money, more research, more program on investigate how to prevent them getting in contact with the system. If they get involved in the system, then we have to go back to another research system, another program to help them, which is more expensive and more difficult to help them get out of the system.
Could I say something in response to this last question here?
Yes, Professor, you can. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I think that the question of prevention, particularly for children, we've had, as I mentioned, in Ontario, we have the Better Beginnings program. We've seen that investing starting early in preschools, in programs for school-age children, does have a long-term social payoff in terms of greater engagement in the education system, lower teen pregnancy, and lower offending. So prevention, true prevention, is very important. Secondly, what we've been talking about largely today is intervention. Once a young person has committed offenses, how do we respond? And certainly I think part of that is accountability. So there is a role for the police, there is a role for the courts, but the question was raised, what about getting tough with youth crime? We've had a major national, if you want, undertaking, almost an experiment, in which we've seen significant decreases in the number of young people in courts, significant decreases in the number of young people in custody, more community-based intervention, and it's actually led or been coincident with a reduction in youth crime. I think that an approach of sending more young people into custody is not effective. We can see that both on a national and on an international level. The kinds of interventions that actually deal with young people's problems, and it was pointed out one of the limitations of custody is young people are removed from their homes, from their schools, from their communities, and sent somewhere else. It may be that while they are in custody, they are well behaved, but the issue is, can we reintegrate them in their community so they're going to be effective, productive citizens? And once we remove them from the community, reintegrating them is much more difficult. And so when it was asked what kinds of programs do we have that are effective, the most effective ones, generally speaking, are those that are community and family oriented. Some of them will involve aspects aspects of culture and recreation. That doesn't mean, though, there's not a role for accountability. In appropriate cases, there can be community service, there can and should be restitution to victims, there can and should be probation. But changing young people is a critical thing. Locking up a young person is relatively easy to do. It's expensive, but it's often not the most effective response.
Thank you very much. I want to thank all of you for your presentations today. You've given us a lot to think about. And Professor Bala, that is going to be what we will be thinking of, your last sentence. And all the presentations and all four of you have made will certainly be very important in our reflections. And I thank you for making yourselves available at such short notice. Thank you very much. We will take a 5-minute break. Thank you. She's often represented at our committee and other committees in the Senate, and we very much welcome you. Catherine?
It's to be here. Is this on? Is this on? The John Howard Society of Canada is a community-based charity whose mission is to support effective, just, and humane responses to the causes and consequences of crime. The Society has more than 60 frontline offices across the country, many with programs and services to support the safe reintegration of offenders into our communities and to prevent crime. We provide services to individuals in need, regardless of their race, religion, age, sexual orientation, criminal record, etc. The services we provide depend on the needs of our clients in the communities served. In some cases, such as the Northwest Territories, our clients are mostly First Nations individuals, and in urban centers, our clients reflect many different races. We provide services for youth to prevent crime and for those who have been in conflict with the law. Thank you for the kind invitation to speak to you about the youth justice system and visible minorities. There is no question that certain groups are overrepresented in the youth justice system: First Nations, blacks, males, former wards of the state, the poor, those with mental health challenges, cognitive impairments and brain injuries, victims of violence, etc. I understand this committee is interested in the challenge of the overrepresentation in the youth justice system of visible minority youth. I was going to mention that I had imagined that previous witnesses would have provided you with a lot of data, but having listened to some of the previous witnesses, I think that's probably not the case, and I was simply going to refer you to some statistics that were contained in the Star article that came out on the weekend, March 1st, 2013. Oh, a year ago. Unequal justice, Aboriginal and black inmates disproportionately fill Ontario jails. And in that article, it indicates that Aboriginal boys 12 to 17 are 5 times more represented in the Ontario youth facilities, that there are 4 times more black males aged 12 to 17 in youth Ontario facilities. And there are 10 times more Aboriginal girls in Ontario youth facilities. And young black females, interestingly enough, were not overrepresented in Ontario youth facilities. I would just raise that I think it is important to get a handle on the statistics so that you know what you're looking at, and that may be a bit of a start for the Ontario issues, but I think you'll find quite a different story in some of the other provinces. All of us wish there was an easy answer to this, but history, poverty, and marginalization have left a legacy of hardship and challenges for many of these youth. The higher numbers in youth custody is a symptom of much broader social and economic problems, and it would be a mistake to think the answers lie in changes to the youth justice system alone. If we are able to make a difference in the lives of individual youths, we need to examine 3 clear categories of change or phenomena. One is social and economic policy. Inequality needs to be addressed. If groups get mired in poverty and see no way of getting out and contributing constructively to society, negative social outcomes, including violence and crime, follow. Whatever may have led certain groups, communities, or families within Canada to be trapped in poverty, pathways need to be built so they can have hope that this can and will be overcome. So what you find is that, and I think some of the information that you've received, it's pretty clear that newly arrived Canadians are actually underrepresented, their children are underrepresented in the youth justice system, and it is only when there's been an opportunity for people to get stuck at low levels and not see an opportunity to advance that you start to see this generational trap where people get caught in crime. Second big area is crime prevention. And there can be no doubt that there are communities in Canada where our youth are at risk. I must confess that before being the Executive Director of the John Howard Society, I was the Director General of Youth Justice Policy for the Federal Department of Justice, so perhaps I know a bit more about this area than I really should. But one of the areas that we were concerned about when we were bringing in the Youth Justice Act, which was intended really to try and address the needs of young people in their communities rather than through the justice system, was the capacity of some Aboriginal communities to discharge that. And we were very worried that we would have a negative consequence of actually the proportions of Aboriginal youth going up if we didn't provide some support for Aboriginal communities and support their ability to be able to deal with youth in their communities. So what we did was to try and figure out the numbers. We did a one-day snapshot of Aboriginal youth in custody. So we went to all of the provinces and asked them to do a head count of the number of youth that were First Nations who were in their communities on a particular day. So what communities did they come from? Where were they when they committed the offense that led to custody? And what community were they proposing to return to after their custodial sentence? And we got very interesting data about the proportion of First Nations people in the youth justice system, and essentially the gateway of young people coming in to the youth justice system in bigger numbers. And while it might not have been a surprise to some, it was through Western urban centers. And the real gateway for youth coming into custody at that time was Winnipeg. So we introduced a cities project in Winnipeg where we worked with an Aboriginal elder who had a background in corrections and a police officer who did a lot of work in the front end. They worked with all of their contacts in their communities. And then the actual number of First Nations people coming into the youth justice corrections system reduced significantly by building the capacity and putting the capacity in where you knew the problems lay. So I just put that as a positive example. And what's very interesting also is to actually talk to some of these kids or young people who are in communities that are at high risk. And if you haven't done so, you may be surprised, because one of the things that struck me was the first thing that they asked for is, we need a place to be safe. These kids feel endangered in some of those communities. And we assume that the danger is coming from them, but they perceive themselves as being at risk of violence. And I think it's really important to try and address those kinds of things. So I think it's really key to try and figure out what your problem is, what community you're in, what are the unique problems facing the individuals in those communities, and how do you put the support structures in place that will stand the best chance of meeting those kids' needs, giving them hope that they can survive and overcome the challenges that they're facing and the negative influences that they're feeling from their particular community. So crime prevention, I think, is key, but I think it has to be more than just spending money on programs. There was a very good this one is a 2014, February 26 article where the United States had reviewed their crime prevention programs and said after decades of spending, minority youth still overrepresented in the system. And it gives a good idea of where those resources should be spent in order to actually have good outcomes. I think that is also key. And we need to learn from what works. We need to test out different stuff, and we need to learn from what works. The third category that we really need to look at is opportunities and challenges within the youth justice system itself. One of the really significant problems, and I think people have raised it, is we need to be very wary about negative stereotyping by those in the justice system. More people come out of poverty not committing offenses than do. It's very easy to make stereotypes, particularly if they're race-based, and it can lead to, I think, what the last set of witnesses was talking about, the likelihood that youth that are from these marginalized communities will be stopped more by police and will be hounded more. We also need to ensure that the risk-need tools and other diagnostic program devices are impartial. What you will often find is that they will have something in there that assesses potential risk, which can really be telling in terms of how the justice system deals with them, that is not weighted properly for certain cultures or certain cultural risks. So you really need to look at those risk-need assessment tools. I'll give you an example, and this is not necessarily related to them, but I deal with a lot of adult inmates, and they were doing a risk-need assessment, and some of the standard questions are, how much time do you spend with your family? And of course, if you're incarcerated, the amount of time you're actually spending with your family is reduced. So you're ending up with very low scores on these risk need assessments because you may be away from your family in a boarding school or whatever. So I think that needs to be addressed. I think it is important to treat all young people as individuals and base tailored alternatives and community-based sentences or rehabilitation plans on that particular individual. For many visible minority youth, culturally relevant options will resonate well with them, whether this is drumming or sweat lodges or learning rap music or whatever it happens to be. Others will want more mainline rehabilitation, reintegration tools like housing, job opportunities, education, and some will want both. And I think it's very important to look at the individual and to try and listen to the individual's needs and try and figure out how best to line that up so that they're available for the young person who has been involved in the justice system. Something that we haven't looked at but is growing and may be particularly relevant for some who live in these high-risk neighborhoods are trauma-based practices. A lot of young people who've been exposed to a lot of violence, and some of those young people who are coming from those high-risk neighborhoods will have seen their friends shot and killed. Some of them will have been exposed to violence within their families. There is a lot of trauma that goes with that, and there has been some considerable amount of success by tailoring responses that address some of the trauma that young people may have experienced in their communities. So I think that's an opportunity that we should be looking at in the future. In conclusion, I'd just like to say, as a society, we face a challenge of the overrepresentation of certain groups in our justice system. Today, we're looking at the overrepresentation of visible minority youth, but I think to be effective and fair in our response, we need to tackle underlying social and economic problems that affect them and their communities and that are correlated with higher crime rates. The youth criminal justice system should be used with restraint, and there should be no discrimination in the youth justice system. The Youth Criminal Justice Act allows for culturally relevant practices at the front end, at alternatives, at custody, and at reintegration, and these should be encouraged for youth who want them. So I think there are lots of untapped opportunities that we could be looking at. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Senator Eggleton.
Well, thank you for that presentation. That's excellent, and I quite agree with you that we need to look at the underlying social economic issues here: poverty, inequality, housing, job opportunities, education, etc. But I'd like to go and focus for a moment on the programs that are operating. Similar question to what I asked the last panel. The Department of Justice in the first panel talked about their Youth Justice Fund and the Youth Justice Services Funding Program. And then Public Safety Canada talked about the National Crime Prevention Strategy. Are there aspects of these programs that stand out for you as being quite worthwhile, quite successful? What do you think they should be covering that they're not? And talk about the adequacy of funding for the programs that the federal government, through these two departments, could be funding. That's quite aside from the underlying social economic issues. And one other thing I want to ask you is that what do we do about this data problem? How do you think we can get a handle on that? These programs primarily operate for at-risk youth, yes, but we are focusing at this point on visible minorities, but still, I think in either case we need to get a handle on the data about youth to better justify other programming needs. So, over to you.
Okay, well, I'll start with the data. And I think it would be quite reasonable to ask the Department of Justice to collect the data that you need to see. I can tell you from having done the one-day snapshot that there will be some cost to them involved in terms of paying for the time for the provincial data collectors to actually collect the data. But it was basically processed within the Department of Justice once the data had arrived. And there are many fewer young people in custody now, so I think you could get answers to that fairly quickly. In terms of programs that are working well, I think there are a number of programs that are working well, and the challenge is to ensure that there is some sort of an evaluation of those particular programs. And the Youth Justice Fund was supposed to be looking at innovative programs. So some of them should have worked, some of them shouldn't have worked, and a lot of them were funded, and some of them turned out to work surprisingly well. For example, one of the ones that I thought was going to be not shall we say, useful in terms of demonstrating where possible we ought not to go in the future, was in connection with drama, providing drama skills for young people who were at risk of being involved in gangs. And that turned out to be very successful. And I think, I'm not entirely sure why, except that perhaps it gives them an opportunity to step outside the socialized role and think about how they could act in a different way. So I think it's important to try and assess these programs and to share the results about what's working and what's not working. I know as a community-based organization, we try and share information amongst John Howard societies across the country about the type of programs that are working well so that they can be duplicated or certain patterns of success can be followed up in different areas of the community. But where John Howard has had some success is in supporting some of the higher risk young people in terms of providing them with housing and support and supporting their reintegration back into the communities. So there are a lot of successful things that can be done. If you ask young people, which I always think is important when you're developing programs for them, they would say if there was one adult, if these are kids in custody, if there was one adult who cared about me en route, who I felt I could go to and seek guidance, it would have made a big difference in my life. And I'm really keen on mentoring programs. I'm very, very keen on peer support programs. Young people who have walked the same path as young people who are struggling now and made it successfully out the other side have something to share with young people that are struggling that resonates with them. It gives them hope. Now, John Howard Society would say, to help with the correction of young people or anybody who's in conflict with the law, you need a standard set of supports. You need education, you need housing, you need something that addresses the psychological problems that the person may be facing. You need to address any kind of addiction or substance abuse issues. And basically, you need a full gamut of supports around a particular person in order to help them back into society. And I think that's equally true with young people.
What about the crime prevention program?
Does
it need a lot more money, you think?
I think it would benefit from an enormous infusion of resources. There's a very good, I don't know what you would describe it as, an advisor to, I think it's the Washington state government, who actually does a cost-benefit analysis of programs, including crime prevention programs as well as intervention programs, that sort of says, for this amount of taxpayers' dollars, this is the cost saving in the long run. And it's pretty clear that for the investments that they're making in effective crime prevention programs, you're saving a lot in terms of future policing, corrections, and justice costs.
A Canadian study on that?
No, but it would be really, I think, worthwhile to emulate that. The closest thing that I've seen is in connection with homelessness, and you see a connection between crime and homelessness.
Yes.
And they have looked at providing social housing and the savings that provides in terms of emergency room calls and the calls on the justice system. There are huge savings by providing housing. So I think these broader costing models are something that should certainly be pursued.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation, and thank you for being on both sides of the spectrum here. So you speak to us from a well-informed position. Talk to me about you mentioned trauma-based practices. We see, in the Greater Toronto, where I hail from, several incidences that have taken place that I've attended to, and communities, visible minority communities, tend not to gain that same sense of support when it comes to these homicides that have taken place in these townhouse complexes, churches, malls. That there seemed not to be that sense of reaction to those communities. So can you elaborate for me on that in terms of just what needs to be done to really help these young people when they're in this traumatic situation? Now I've got a couple other questions as well.
Well, I think you mentioned was it the year of the gun or the summer of the gun?
2005, yes.
2005. And at that time, there was 3 levels of government participating in a response to those tragedies. And I felt that had shown great promise in terms of helping to mobilize support for those particular communities and empowering some of the leaders in those communities to speak out and to address some of those concerns. Now, it takes an infusion of resources to be able to do that as well. In terms of the trauma-based, I was thinking about some young people that I had met from the Jane Finch area, and I think his name's Devin Jones. I don't know if you know him, but he works with the school board in some of the communities where there's a lot of gang problems. And he was talking about how traumatized the students were when there was gun violence that affected one of their fellow students.
Yeah, Jordan Manners, I think.
Yeah. I don't see how there couldn't be trauma associated with that. And the last thing you want is for them to get inured to violence. You want them to be able to have a safe place for dealing with that particular trauma and for putting measures in place that continue to make them feel safe and help them to overcome that. I think if people feel that the only way that they can feel safe is to have a gang at their backs, it promotes the wrong response. And I think we really need to think about what motivates young people to join gangs. And I think it is that feeling of being personally at risk. So I think there's a lot to be said for trying to address some of those underlying problems. And I think they're fairly unique. Not that other communities you don't have that, but you wouldn't necessarily have that in some other Canadian communities.
Talk to me about, again, in terms of the work that you do with Corrections Canada. In terms of just individuals coming out of the system. What do you do with them while they're in the system? I'm sort of curious as to what programs are in place. You talk about the lack of resources and the fact there's a cost benefit to intervention as opposed to incarceration. We know that it's probably 5 times higher. My stats might be off, but we know that it costs more to keep somebody incarcerated than it is to keep them outside of the system.
Absolutely.
And so talk to me about programming that helps the individual. I believe in truly rehabilitating this individual life skills, education while they're in, those individuals who've gone through, heard from previous panels of them missing education. So what's been done internally to really touch the lives of those individuals, if you could?
Again, I would say not enough is being done internally, and that's probably not the answer that you want to hear. But what's happened is that the number of federal offenders, youth corrections is going down, adult corrections is going up. And it's not necessarily based on increasing numbers who've committed crimes, but basically longer sentences. So the whole tough on crime stuff means that there's fewer resources inside the federal penitentiaries to provide the services and the support and the reintegration, they call it the corrections plan, fulfilling their corrections plan, which is supposed to give them the social skills, the psychological well-being, the physical well-being to actually go out and make a contribution in their communities. And they go out in a graduated, they should be going out on parole, in a graduated response where they're supported and supervised as they're making a very difficult transition back into their communities, often back into the same communities where they had problems before. Young people, I think, need a different skill set. I do think education is probably more important for them because a lot of the times their education has been disrupted. And they're still at a point where they can catch up. For me, dealing with some of the underlying issues, high numbers of young people end up in the custody system who have cognitive impairments, ADHD, FASD, brain injuries, and mental health problems. So there's a lot of issues that need to be addressed so that you can find a good strategy for a particular individual. So you really need to look at the individual's issues and what their challenges are. And for young people, strength-based approaches tend to work better. So instead of saying, don't do this, don't do that, don't do this, and you can give them a whole list of things that they ought not to do and a whole list of things that they ought to do, but you need to work with the things that they're actually good at doing and build on their strengths. They need to feel a sense of self-worth and a sense that they can overcome their immediate problems and contribute in the future.
Senator, to that, Thank you, Chair. My question is, and what types of crime do you find that young men and women are most involved, and what are the rates of being charged as opposed to being dealt with by other formal means? And what roles do parents play? How important is the parental role?
You raised some very good questions. I could probably dig up the statistics for you on how many are dealt. There's been some excellent front-end policing statistical work done on the youth justice system by Peter Carrington out at the University of Waterloo, and he may be able to give you that police discretion and how they're using that at the front end. In terms of the types of crimes that young people are being charged with, I think the panel before you was absolutely correct in highlighting the number of administration of justice breaches. One of the most likely responses to ending up in custody is an administration of justice breach. So murder, these high-end, serious violent offenses will get you a custody sentence, as will administration of justice breaches. So not being able to comply with conditions that are being imposed on bail and on probation. And some, there are stories, and you'd have to verify this, that some of the conditions are actually setting some young people up to fail. For example, in some of the First Nations families, they will say, they'll release the kid on the condition that they can't be in a house where there's alcohol, but their parents will be alcoholics, so the only place they have to live is essentially a violation of one of their conditions, and they'll be breached and find themselves back in. So it's, I think we need to look at that very seriously. Generally, young people are in there for administration of justice breaches and property crimes is the heart and soul of youth justice crime is property crime.
Is that finished? And the role that, parental supervision, we talk about roles, the society roles, provincial responsibility, federal responsibility, but what about family responsibility?
Well, families play a huge protective factor for young people who are in conflict with the law. So where you find problems is impoverished. I'll just give you impoverished examples. Impoverished single mothers work very hard. They often will carry 2 to 3 jobs, which means they're not always available to be providing the support for their children when they come home from school. So you can get problems like that because people are stretched in order to just make ends meet and so are not available to their young people. In other cases, some of the systemic issues you will find in some dysfunctional communities is generational substance abuse, so that the families are not able to really provide the guidance and support to the young people in the same way. And an organization that may not be discharging its parental role in quite the same way are wards of the state, a large number of young people who find themselves foster kids or taken away from their families and put in the child welfare system are not getting the kind of family and parental support that you would find. So generally you would find an overrepresentation of kids who are in conflict with the law who have not the kind of familial supports that we would like for a variety of reasons.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. You know, it's good that you were working on both sides with the justice and now the job you're doing. I was very disappointed today with the justice and the correctional public safety presentation because they just bragged about what programs they're doing. But it's a very complex problem. They're looking after youth after they've got into trouble. There are prevention issues. But for me, what was very disappointing is they didn't talk about the systemic discrimination that exists. You know, we all know, and I can't think of the abbreviation that's always used, but a young black youth is driving some, you know, and stopped just because he's driving a fancy car. I mean, prominent people's children have been stopped like that. So it's not just about, you know, it can be on any street in the country. It doesn't have to be in certain streets. And I'd like you to address that because there definitely is a bias in our system. There is systemic discrimination. And, you know, earlier on the two lawyers spoke about how a young person can be arrested and, you know, the substantial charge or the charge that they were originally charged may not even proceed, but they've gone through the system and may lose a year in school. So can you address the issue of systemic discrimination?
Certainly the UN documents with respect to children's rights say that there should be no discrimination in the youth justice system. So, you know, we meet and, you know, nobody wants to see any kind of negative stereotyping or prejudgment or systemic discrimination in a justice system. That's why the model of justice is wearing a blindfold. They're supposed to be just, you know, being impartial and objective and based on the facts. So it is challenging, and it's hard to know how to eradicate this. You would need to know whether or not there's profiling going on, which is another very sensitive issue. The challenge is that a lot of the young people who are being hounded are coming from neighborhoods where there's a considerable amount of crime, and that provides a bit of an opportunity for the police to think that this is an area where they're, you know, doing their jobs and being fairly aggressive. But they need to have reasonable grounds, and it isn't enough. The color of one's skin or their ethnic background is not enough to really trigger a reasonable grounds to stop someone. So I find it extremely challenging. There are other things which are more subtle in terms of having a negative effect on those who lack resources and are impoverished, and I think the Defense Council here sort of raised it, and that has to do with a number of young people who do not meet bail or find themselves in remand because their families cannot find a surety or cannot find the resources, and this causes real problems. They're more likely to plead guilty. They're more likely to be found guilty. The numbers, while we've had a lot of success in terms of reducing the numbers of young people in sentenced custody, I think a lot of us who've studied the numbers are not happy with the reductions in remand. So that continues to be a problem, and I bet you anything that if you looked at who's being held in remand, you will see a lot of First Nations kids and a lot of black kids that are being detained on remand.
Before we work on a study, we get briefing notes on what the lay of the land is. And over the weekend when I was reading this, it was really bothering me, and I'll read it to you very quickly. Blacks are more likely to be taken for processing to the station to be held overnight in pretrial custody and conditions. Racial bias in the justice system has been recognized in a number of cases, and one study, and it discusses the disproportionate overrepresentation of blacks in pretrial detention. It seems to be rooted to a large extent in the types of information which the Crown and the Justice of the Peace rely when reviewing the case in bail court. Above and beyond legally relevant factors, these scholars found that the more negative the police moral assessment of an accused person, in the more likely that this individual will be held in custody. And it's not me speaking, it's the study that says, given that the police tend to provide more negative character assessments of black accused than accused from other racial ethnic groups, the factor would appear to explain, at least in part, the higher proportion of blacks being detained. There are many, many studies of this nature. And my concern is that if we don't name it, we can't deal with it.
Yeah.
And the first two witnesses who represent our justice system and public safety system couldn't even talk about it.
Yeah.
So if we don't name it, how are we going to deal with it?
There's no question that the factors that go into informing discretion by decision makers in the system, they should be held accountable for what they're looking at and why they've made decisions in the way that they have made them. And collecting information about why they have made decisions, which you can sort of target by the nature of the results, I think would go some distance to helping to correct some of it. But it's very difficult to get at this. It's challenging.
Thank you. Going to second round, and that's Senator Meredith.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Ms. Latimer. I thoroughly enjoyed your perspective on this issue. We heard from Professor Kwok with respect to alienation, hopelessness. You mentioned just prior to answering that question with respect to young people being set up to fail, and then further stigmatizes them. So if your organization have put forth the top 3 recommendations with respect to the chair's question, with respect to systemic barriers that exist for visible minority, especially youth, what would those top 3 recommendations be if you were to, sorry to put you on the spot, but if you could answer it, but if you can't, put it in writing to us. Because I believe that we've done so many reports, we've talked about this issue, and it continues. OCI has come out with a report saying that there's 1.5 times more likely to be, held in, further in terms of isolation, knowing that they're not going to offend again, knowing that they have less needs and so forth. And these statistics are alarming, and we need to begin to change. So if there were 3 things that you could say to us that would or have your organization put forth any sort of recommendation, seeing that you've got such a well-balanced view on all of this from both sides. You've been on the inside, you're on the outside now helping those who are trying to get back to some sense of normalcy. And I don't believe in just talking about something. I believe in acting upon it and actually putting things that can be implemented or can be brought to the departments, that are making these decisions. And it goes, I know it's a deep issue. However, I think we need to start somewhere. So if you had top 3, top 5, top 7 recommendations, I don't want to extend the list, but certainly I would welcome that.
Well, I am of the strong view that if you can keep kids out of the justice system, you should. The justice system has a very negative association for young people. It affects their self-esteem. It affects all kinds of things. So I would start with, my first recommendation would be effective, tailored, sustained, program-sustained crime prevention that is really targeting at-risk communities or at-risk youth. People don't like to talk about youth being at risk, but if you work in those communities, you know the ones that
they're
feel...
in crisis, actually. There's a percentage of that's in crisis.
Yeah, these kids are crying out. They need help. And my view is if you can get them mentors, support that will work on their, help them understand their strengths and help them find a way to, act on their strengths, see that they can get a job or whatever their goal is. You can help them advance towards their goal. I would say that's key, and that has to do with individual kids. I think you have to start with you count your wins one kid at a time, but you got to start somewhere, and you got to try and deliver. And I would start in those communities. I would start in certain communities. I would also really go after those kids who are wards of the state. If you're a Crown ward, you're lonely. I guess the important thing to say is the one who becomes the chronic problem for the justice system in the long run is not basically your tough kid, it's your lonely kid. And surely we can do better as a society for going after those kids who are lonely, marginalized, and alienated. So a lot of them, you're going to find them going through the child welfare system. So I would put in all kinds of supports for kids going through the child welfare system as well. So prevention would be key. The second thing I think you need to do is to work with the front end of the justice system by working on some of those preconceived ideas, by getting them to exercise discretion, by demonstrating that some program alternatives, by referring kids away from the justice system and towards a program which builds on their strengths, will actually do a lot more in the long run than charging them and trying to bring them into the justice system. So I think you need to break down. We had to have forum after the Year of the Gun in Toronto, where we had people from the affected communities, police officers, kids themselves, so on, and my program manager was putting it together, worked very hard at integrating them all, and then they were allowed to go and sit with them. Police sat on one side and the kids sat on another side, and my goodness, the common ground was just about zero. And after a full day of discussions, people began to see things a little bit differently. But the police did not understand those youth, and the youth did not understand where the police were coming from. And the hostility and lack of trust was like so thick you could cut it with a knife. So there needs to be a lot of work at the front end with the police. Now, they have a job to do to try and make people in those communities feel safe, including the kids that they think, because not all of them are going to end up in gangs. A lot of them are going to be just scared, and I think the police need to work on that as well. So community involvement with the police and working at the front end, I think, is critical. And then I think the justice system has lots of untapped possibilities for having more culturally relevant approaches for those who do get into the youth justice system. But boy, I'd like to keep them out, and I'd really like to keep them out of custody, if you can. Dr. Seidman?
Thank you. Actually, this leads quite nicely, I guess, into my question, in the sense that you talked a lot about prevention, and now you've talked a bit about the police and the youth and how they behaved in this day-long session that they had together. And the Ontario Association of Chiefs of Police has in fact launched a 2014 crime prevention campaign, and they are featuring an informational crime prevention booklet that's going to be used by police services across Ontario to promote local crime prevention initiatives. So my question to you is, how do you see the role of police in youth crime prevention?
Well, it's interesting that you say that. When we first started at Youth Justice, we started giving out an award to police officers for their activities that reflected the spirit of the Youth Criminal Justice Act. And we had many, police officers who do great stuff, like really good stuff. And police, they don't mind having a game of ball hockey with some kids. So they like it, particularly the kids, the police officers who are on the beat and work in these communities. So, to the extent that it can be encouraged, certainly the Mounties have that as sort of a key objective of theirs, and it's great to hear that the chiefs of police are encouraging the crime prevention activities as well. Huge differences between communities in terms of how people view the police. In my neighborhood, we were always told, if you get lost, you better go find a police officer, and we were instructed that these guys are to serve and protect, and they're going to help you if you're in trouble. Other communities, you don't have that. You don't have that sense, and the hostility and antagonism is too great. No, I think it's very encouraging that the chiefs of police have been pretty good in terms of encouraging their youth officers in particular to work with young people. So.
Thank you very much for your presentation,
My
and
pleasure.
I would ask my colleagues to continue sitting here. This is the end of our witnesses for today. We still have some in-camera matters to deal with, so may I please ask you to stay for...
We need to deal with the budget in public.
Oh, okay, sorry, we have to deal with the budget in public, so there is a budget in front of you, and that is the budget of... we are still getting many, many requests for the cyberbullying reports, and we are asking for your permission for courier charges of 200 and printing for 7,000. And as you know, that we only print as and when the request is made, not before that. And we are getting so many requests that we thought that we would ask for this amount, but we obviously will not use it if we are not required to. So are there any questions on this budget? Have someone so moved? Okay, thank you. So now we'll go in camera. Do you mind? Now we'll go in camera and
we'll need to pause for just
if we can pause for a few minutes.